Stalin decides not to withdraw the Red Army from northern Iran after the end of the war. According to the treaties that had been signed during the war, this sparks the kind of first crisis of the Cold War. The first issue that was put on the agenda of the UN Security Council was this Iranian crisis. There's a big debate in the historiography as to how and why the Red Army withdrew from northern Iran. Some historians say that it was thanks to the machinations of the Iranian Prime Minister of the day, Ahmad Qavam. Qavam managed to make a deal with Stalin to create a joint Soviet-Iranian company to explore for oil in northern Iran in exchange for the withdrawal of Soviet troops. But this deal is never ratified by the Iranian parliament, and in the end, it never materializes. Other historians give the credit to Harry Truman and to the US for putting pressure on Stalin to withdraw, for threatening the Soviets. The lesson that the Shah takes from this crisis is that a very strong Iranian army is absolutely crucial to maintaining Iran's independence and territorial integrity, and that the only source for being able to establish an army like that is the United States. During Mossadegh's premiership, Mossadegh had a foreign policy that he called negative equilibrium. He was rejecting this traditional Iranian concept of balancing foreign powers' influence in Iran. When it was proposed to give an oil concession to the Russians in northern Iran to balance the one the British had in southern Iran, he very famously said, well, this is like a man who's had one arm amputated, cutting off the other arm in order to have balance. It doesn't make any sense. Throughout the oil crisis itself, during Mossadegh's premiership, the Truman administration tries very hard to secure some kind of compromise. There's lots of mediation efforts, attempts to get the British and the Iranians to reach some kind of deal, but they're never successful. And the reason is because what Britain wants and what Iran wants is mutually exclusive. The Iranians are willing to give compensation, they're willing to, all kinds of formulas are developed for a deal, but what they're not willing to agree to is anything short of Iranian control of Iranian oil. Eventually the Americans essentially lose patience with Mossadegh and come to the conclusion that the longer this crisis goes on, the weaker the Iranian government becomes, the more likely that there could be a communist coup in Iran. Eventually, they agree to various British proposals to covertly overthrow Mossadegh. The coup is a real trauma in the US-Iran relationship. All those Iranians who'd looked to the US as a friend to Iran, as a country that stood on the side of Iran's independence, felt betrayed that the US had supported Britain in overthrowing a democratically elected Iranian leader. The challenge for the Shah after 1953 is how to convince people that he is some kind of authentic Iranian nationalist. And he never really manages to do that, I think. The Eisenhower administration does everything possible to consolidate the Shah's power after the coup. They help him to establish a fairly brutal security service, SAVAK. They pour money into the Iranian army, and Iran essentially becomes a client state of the US in the Cold War. In the mid to late 1950s, as Iran's oil exports recover and as American money begins to flow into Iran, there is something of a kind of boom, economic development, and there's a lot of sort of building dams, and the first small Iranian nuclear reactor is built then under the Atoms for Peace program that the Eisenhower administration has. Of course, politically, it's far from normal. This is a period when power is being consolidated more and more and more in the hands of the Shah. And it's becoming more and more difficult to voice any kind of criticism or opposition to the Shah. So one of the first things that the Shah does when Kennedy comes to office is to try to see if Kennedy is going to maintain this flow of arms to Iran. And so what the Shah does is he decides to send an envoy to Washington to meet with Kennedy. For the job, he chooses General Teymur Bakhtiar. General Bakhtiar was the head of SAVAK, so the head of the security service. There are some sources that say that when Bakhtiar goes to meet with his counterpart, the head of the CIA, he says to the Americans, to the CIA officials, how would you feel about me taking power in Iran? How would you feel about a coup against the Shah? And you can imagine what the Americans thought when the person that the Shah has sent as his envoy to Washington, comes to Washington and says to them, well, how about we have a coup in Iran? I mean, that says something about the stability of the Shah's regime and his grip on power. In 1955, when he joins the Baghdad Pact, this pro-Western alliance of states in the Middle East, Iran is formally aligned, with the US and with the West. There's a defense treaty that's signed between the US and Iran in 1959. There's not really any question of Iran being a non-aligned country after the sort of mid to late 1950s. But in the 1970s, this period of sort of relaxation of tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States, it's not really clear then what non-alignment means. Because when you don't have to choose sides in the Cold War, then what does it really mean to be non-aligned? The Shah, interestingly, pursues his own sort of little détente policy, which is to use Iranian oil to reach out to these countries in Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, communist countries, and to the Soviet Union. And in fact, he begins exporting oil and gas to the Soviet bloc. And his thinking is that, well, détente could be very dangerous for a country like Iran, because what if the United States makes some kind of deal with the Soviet Union and sells Iran out? His strategy is to give the Soviets a stake in Iran's stability and in the continuation of the monarchy in Iran. And the way he's going to do this is by basically providing them with oil and providing them with gas. And it's quite an effective strategy. It works pretty well. We don't think of the Shah as a non-aligned leader, but his foreign policy, especially in the 70s, had a lot of these hallmarks of non-alignment. The basic idea behind the White Revolution was to avoid a Red Revolution, right? And a White Revolution would be a bloodless revolution from the top that would essentially address all of the issues or grievances that could be exploited by the radical left in Iran. The Shah is trying to be a conservative monarch of a very old monarchy, and at the same time a radical revolutionary who's transforming his society. And it's not really feasible to do that. It alienated the monarchy from its traditional constituency, which was the landowners, the clergy, the army, conservative elements of society. But it pleased the Americans, and it fed into this whole idea of modernization that was so central to American foreign policy at that time in the Cold War. But the Shah was, completely enamored of it and trumpeted it at every occasion, and never missed an opportunity to remind, especially his American interlocutors, that he was this great reformer. But the real change in Iranian society didn't come about as a result of the White Revolution. It came about as a result of the massive inflow of oil income to Iran, which created a very powerful Iranian state, and which created a lot of new industries and really a whole new class in Iran, a big middle class, a salaried middle class, which in itself generated more problems for the Shah. By the late 1960s, British power in the Middle East has been in decline for a long time. The turning point is Suez, of course, the Suez crisis, when Britain loses control of the Suez Canal. And although the British want to maintain their position in the Persian Gulf, because they have such significant financial and oil interests. The reality is that it's not sustainable. Britain is experiencing a massive economic crisis in the late 1960s, has to turn to the IMF for loans, and the Labour government of Harold Wilson decides that Britain really has to make a fundamental change in its foreign policy, turning away from empire and towards Europe. British would have to lay the groundwork for the regional security framework after they had left. The United States was not willing to play that role, to fill that vacuum. The US, you have to remember, in 1968, this is the time, the peak of the Vietnam War. And so this means that the local powers themselves will have to manage the security of the region. They begin to try to create some kind of understanding between Iran and Saudi Arabia, but this is very difficult because there are significant tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia. There is a kind of delicate period of negotiation. A lot of territorial disputes have to be resolved. The Bahrain question, the whole issue of these islands, Abu Musa and the Tums. Each one of them could be a tripwire for some kind of regional conflict. But then, of course, in 1969, the Nixon administration comes to office, and this strengthens the Shah's hand considerably. And he begins to assert Iran's dominance in the region. The Shatt al-Arab crisis of 1969, it puts everyone on notice that the Shah is a force to be reckoned with. The Iraqis have a dispute with Iran over their common border in the Shatt al-Arab waterway. The Iraqis insist that Iranian ships sailing down the Shatt should fly an Iraqi flag, because of course the Iraqi claim is that the whole of the Shatt al-Arab is Iraqi territory. The Iranians' position being that the border is in the middle. This sparks a crisis, and the Shah is on a visit to Tunisia, is on a state visit to Tunisia, and his officials in Tehran are panicking and send these kind of cables off to Tunis and asking for instructions, and the Shah is absolutely furious and tells them, don't give in an inch, and he orders them to sail a ship down the Shatt al-Arab flying an Iranian flag with a naval escort and an air escort, and this absolutely scares the hell out of all of his generals and advisors. It makes the Americans very nervous, but they have really no choice but to go along with it. And it works. The Iraqis back down, and it's a success. But it's the first real sort of show of force by the Iranians, that the Shah is not to be meddled with. This kind of attitude, this kind of policy continues. It really heralds an era where, at least a good decade, until the Iranian Revolution, when Iran is the dominant power in the Persian Gulf. The Nixon administration, and of course Richard Nixon, brings Henry Kissinger into the White House as his national security advisor, and the two of them, Nixon and Kissinger, formulate a very revolutionary and novel understanding of America's containment policy in what's called the Nixon Doctrine. They take the view that the U.S. should support its local allies and friends to be able to fight these battles on their own. Give them the resources that they need in order to be able to defend themselves, rather than American troops having to be committed to any of these local conflicts in faraway places. And this fits in perfectly, of course, with the Shah's ambitions. For decades, he's been trying to convince various American presidents that Iran should have this special place in the world and should be the pillar of American policy in the Middle East and should be the most dominant power in the Persian Gulf. Finally, you have an American president who is receptive to these kind of ideas and is willing to entertain the idea of Iran as a major power, as a partner rather than a client. And so all of this comes to fruition in 1972 when Nixon looks to him and he says, protect me. Here was the President of the United States had come to the court of the Shah to ask him to protect the United States. How the tables had turned. I can only imagine how happy he must have been in that moment. And he then proceeds to gain a number of promises and commitments from Nixon and Kissinger on all kinds of things, weapons systems that he wants to support his covert war in northern Iraq, where Iran, going all the way back to the 1960s, was supporting a Kurdish insurgency. The Kurds are probably the largest sort of single group of people in the Middle East who ended up without a state of their own after the First World War. And they live in Iran and Iraq and in Turkey and Syria on these borderlands. Kurdish nationalism has been a force to reckon with in all of these countries, really since the early 20th century. But for the Shah, it's also an opportunity, because by supporting the Kurds in Iraq, especially Barzani, it's a way to weaken the Iraqi government. The Iraqis have a dispute with Iran over their common border in the Shatt al-Arab waterway. They have ambitions for extending their influence into southern Iran, the Arabic-speaking parts of Iran, and into the Persian Gulf. Iran begins its sponsorship of the Kurdish insurgency in northern Iraq, with the support of Israel from very early on, from around about 1963. Iran and Israel covertly supporting the Kurds. The Israelis, of course, had their own reasons for doing that. In the aftermath of Suez, they were quite keen to try to weaken Arab nationalist forces that were seen to be on the rise. This relationship between Israeli intelligence, the Mossad, and Iranian intelligence, Savak, was crucial to this secret war that was going on. There was always a tension in this policy because, of course, Iran has its own Kurdish minority, and if the Kurds of Iraq ever succeed, it could encourage Iran's Kurds to either join with them or seek autonomy or independence and so on. So there was this delicate game that the Shah played of supporting the Kurds, but never to the point where they would actually achieve independence, just enough to keep the war going, to paralyze the Iraqi army,